October 14, 1943. 15,000 feet above Schweinfurt, Germany. The air is filled with the dull rhythm of machine guns and the faint metallic scent of burning fuel. Dozens of American B-17 flying fortresses crawl across the sky, their aluminum skins glinting in the sun, leaving trails of smoke behind them. Below, the German countryside watches the sky burn. Inside a German Focke-Wulf 190, a young pilot smiles as he scribbles a note in his logbook. Another heavy bomber destroyed. His 17th victory. Through his canopy he watches another B-17 spiral downward, trailing black smoke and fragments of metal. For him this is just another day in the air war. Another easy kill in what Luftwaffe pilots have begun calling the turkey shoot. On that single day, 291 American bombers crossed into German airspace. 60 would never return. 17 more would land too damaged to ever fly again. American crews would later call it Black Thursday. For the Germans, it was confirmation of their dominance in the skies. They had reason to laugh. Their fighters were faster, their tactics sharper, their experience unmatched. The Americans kept coming, but without fighter escort deep into Germany, they were lambs sent to slaughter. But history has a way of turning laughter into silence. Within 4 months, everything that seemed certain would change, and the hunters would become the hunted. By late 1943, the air war over Europe had reached a critical phase. The Allied strategy depended on daylight precision bombing, a bold doctrine led by the U.S. 8th Air Force. Their belief was simple but flawed. Heavily armed bombers flying in tight formations could protect themselves without the need for fighter escorts. Each B-17 flying fortress carried up to 13 50-caliber machine guns. Together, dozens of bombers formed what planners called a combat box, overlapping fields of fire that, in theory, created an impenetrable wall of bullets. But theories die quickly in the face of reality. The Luftwaffe had spent years refining their tactics. Pilots like Walter Dahl, Günther Rall, and Wilhelm Galland knew the strengths and weaknesses of the American formations. They studied attack geometry, approached from blind spots, and developed precise maneuvers to break up bomber boxes. A common technique was the head-on pass, diving straight into the formation at closing speeds over 600 miles per hour. One burst into the cockpit or engines was enough to send a fortress tumbling from the sky. From August through October 1943, these tactics paid off with devastating effect. On August 17th, the Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid cost the Americans 60 bombers, nearly 1 in every 6 that took off. In October, the second raid was even worse. 77 bombers destroyed or written off, 600 men killed or captured. The 8th Air Force lost more in a single day than the entire Luftwaffe had during some months of the Battle of Britain. The problem wasn't courage, it was physics. No Allied fighter had the range to follow the bombers deep into Germany. The P-47 Thunderbolt could reach the border but not Berlin. The twin-engine P-38 Lightning could go farther, but its engines often froze at high altitude in the thin, frigid air of northern Europe. So the bombers went alone. German radar tracked them crossing the channel. Fighter controllers waited until the American escorts turned back. Then came the order. Angriffspunkt, attack point. Dozens of Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts climbed to altitude and pounced. German ace Hans Philipp described it simply. We waited just beyond the point where the little friends turned home. Then we struck. The bombers knew we were coming. You could see their formations tighten like a flock sensing the hawk. Each mission became a test of endurance. Crews flew for hours through anti-aircraft fire, only to face waves of fighters they could not outrun. Gunners fired until their barrels glowed red, until ammunition belts ran dry. Inside the freezing fuselages, men watched friends vanish in silent flashes. Every surviving bomber that limped home was a battered reminder of a brutal truth. Without long-range escorts, the daylight bombing campaign could not be sustained. The U.S. Air Force Command faced a grim dilemma. Either abandon the strategy of daylight precision bombing, or find a fighter capable of flying to the heart of Germany and back. The search for a solution began not in Washington or London, but in a boardroom at North American Aviation. In 1940, British officials approached the company seeking to license build P-40 Warhawks. Instead, North American proposed designing a completely new aircraft, faster, sleeker, and more efficient. They promised a prototype in just 120 days. 4 months later, the NA-73X took flight, the prototype of what would become the P-51 Mustang. Early versions, powered by an Allison V1710 engine, performed well at low altitudes but lost power above 15,000 feet. For bomber escort duties, it was useless. The U.S. Army Air Forces relegated it to ground attack and reconnaissance roles. The Mustang might have remained just another footnote in aviation history, if not for one crucial insight from across the Atlantic. In April 1942, Rolls-Royce test pilot Ronald Harker flew an Allison-powered Mustang and instantly recognized its potential. "The airframe is superb," he noted. "It only needs a better engine." Rolls-Royce engineers fitted the aircraft with their new Merlin 61 engine, the same power plant used in the latest Spitfires. The transformation was extraordinary. Top speed jumped by 50 miles per hour, and performance at high altitude became exceptional. The combination of an American airframe and a British engine had created something unique, a fighter with unmatched efficiency, power, and range. Yet few in the U.S. command understood what this marriage of design truly meant. It would take months before the Mustang reached combat units, but when it did, the entire air war would shift. Meanwhile, 1943 remained the Luftwaffe's year of triumph. The German air defense network was a machine of precision. From radar stations along the coast to command posts deep inside Germany, every layer worked in coordination. Ground controllers guided fighter wings to exact interception points. Pilots were veterans of years of continuous combat, men forged in Poland, France, and the Eastern Front. They viewed the American bombers with a mixture of contempt and admiration. The B-17s were tough. They could absorb incredible punishment, but they were still targets. Luftwaffe aces joked that the U.S. factories built them faster than Germany could shoot them down, but that didn't stop them from trying. Major Günther Rall recalled, "We felt invincible. The bombers came without fighters, and we knew the pattern. Every time. It was a hunting schedule." Yet deep inside Allied planning rooms, something was stirring. Engineers and strategists realized that victory would not come from bravery alone. It would come from solving one equation: distance. If a fighter could reach Berlin, protect the bombers, and still return to England, Germany's air supremacy would collapse from within. The first test of this theory would arrive before the year's end, and it would change the face of the European air war forever. The story of the P-51 Mustang is more than the tale of an aircraft. It is the intersection of human endurance, engineering brilliance, and strategic transformation. Each perspective reveals a different truth about how the balance of the air war shifted in a matter of months. For the American airmen of 1943, the war in the sky was a battle of faith. Crews climbed into bombers before dawn, knowing that nearly 1 in 5 might never return. They called it the aluminum trail, the glimmering path of wreckage stretching across Europe. Letters home spoke of fear disguised as duty. "We keep flying because someone has to," one gunner wrote after Schweinfurt. In the freezing altitudes above Germany, courage became a routine act of survival. The men who pressed forward did so not out of blind confidence, but because they believed their sacrifice could shorten the war for those still on the ground. Tactically, both sides were trapped in a deadly loop. The Americans kept sending bombers deeper into the Reich. The Germans kept perfecting interception methods. Luftwaffe units like JG-11 and JG-26 refined formation attacks where entire squadrons approached head-on, overwhelming the bombers' firepower. German pilots struck in coordinated waves, disengaged, refueled, and attacked again, while the bombers still struggled homeward. It was a methodical system of attrition. The American response, tighter formations, heavier guns, only increased weight and drag, making the bombers even slower and easier to target. The air war had reached a mathematical deadlock that blood alone could not solve. Technologically, the Mustang broke that equation. Its laminar flow wing reduced drag by almost 30%, while its internal fuel system and drop tanks gave it a reach no other single-engine fighter possessed. It burned less fuel, climbed faster, and held its energy longer than the Thunderbolt or Lightning. More than an aircraft, it was a concept, a weapon of endurance. Pilots who transitioned from the P-47 described the difference as moving from a truck to a race car. The Mustang could fight its way to Berlin and still have power left to chase the enemy home. That single capability would redefine what air superiority meant. Leadership played a decisive role in transforming the Mustang from an experiment into a war-winning instrument. When General James Doolittle took command of the 8th Air Force in early 1944, he understood that the old strategy, tying fighters closely to bomber formations, had to change. He issued a radical order. Once the bombers reached the target, fighters were free to hunt the Luftwaffe wherever they could find it. The bombers are no longer the target, Doolittle told his men. The German Air Force is. That shift in thinking turned the Mustang into a predator. No longer tethered, pilots began to strike airfields, strafe trains, and ambush interceptors before they could reach the bomber streams. It was offensive air warfare on an industrial scale. From the German side, disbelief gave way to alarm. For years, Luftwaffe commanders like Hermann Göring had assured Hitler that Germany's heartland was safe, that no enemy fighter could reach Berlin. Their defensive network was built on that assumption. Aircraft factories, training schools, and refueling bases were placed deep in central Germany, far beyond escort range. But in the winter of 1943, German pilots began hearing new reports. Allied fighters sighted over Hanover, over Bremen, then deeper still. At first they dismissed it as mistaken identity. When confirmation came that these new aircraft were Mustangs, panic began to spread. One German ace later said, "We had always known when to expect danger. Now danger came to us anywhere, anytime." The moral dimension of this change was immense. Air combat had once been seen, at least by pilots, as a duel of professionals governed by respect and skill. But by 1944, total war had erased those illusions. Mustangs strafed enemy airfields, rail yards, and convoys without mercy. Pilots like Chuck Yeager and Donald Gentile described the shift in tone. We were no longer protecting bombers. We were hunting anything that moved. The Mustang gave Allied pilots the reach to impose destruction on every level of the German war machine. For civilians on the ground, the sky became a symbol of relentless pressure. A reminder that even far from the front, the war was closing in. The air war had become personal, technological and existential all at once. The next phase would prove just how quickly an invention could alter the fate of nations. The breakthrough came quietly, far from the front lines. In late 1943, the first P-51Bs equipped with Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engines arrived in England. The aircraft were assigned to the 354th Fighter Group, the pioneer Mustang Group, stationed at Boxted in Essex. Their pilots had only days to convert from the heavy P-47 Thunderbolt to the new machine. They soon realized they were sitting on something extraordinary. Lieutenant Colonel Glenn Duncan, one of the first to fly it in combat, later recalled, "The moment I took off, I knew the war had changed. The Mustang didn't climb. It leapt. The plane was fast, responsive, and could cruise farther on less fuel than anything before it. Most importantly, it could finally fly with the bombers all the way to the target and home again." On December 1, 1943, Mustangs flew their first combat sweep over Belgium. Days later, they escorted bombers on a short-range raid over France. In mid-December, they pushed farther than any Allied fighter had gone, nearly 500 miles to Kiel. For the German controllers monitoring radar screens, disbelief turned to confusion. Fighter intercepts reported American escorts still accompanying bombers deep over northern Germany, long after the point where P-47s would have turned back. When the Luftwaffe tried to intercept, the Mustangs were waiting. They dove out of the sun, engaging Me-109s and FW-190s at altitudes above 20,000 feet. German pilots used to attacking defenseless bombers suddenly found themselves under attack from agile, long-range fighters that could match them in climb, outturn them in level flight, and pursue them all the way home. One radio intercept recorded a German controller demanding confirmation, "Sind das wirklich Jäger? Are those really fighters?" By January 1944, the Mustang had begun escorting raids deep into central Germany. American bomber losses dropped dramatically. The Luftwaffe's carefully timed interceptions started to collapse as their formations were shredded by escorting fighters before they could reach the bombers. Pilots who had once fought with precision and discipline now scrambled chaotically under constant threat. Major Klaus Mitusch of JG-26 summed it up grimly after a mission near Münster. "The air war has fundamentally changed. Our sanctuary no longer exists." Each raid pushed the line farther east. On March 4, 1944, the unthinkable happened. American fighters escorted their bombers to Berlin itself. That morning, 60 American heavy bombers assembled above England, forming vast silver patterns across the clouds. Their destination, Berlin, the heart of Nazi Germany. Among them flew squadrons of newly arrived P-51 Mustangs from the 4th Fighter Group, commanded by Colonel Donald Blakesley. It was the mission that German leadership had declared impossible. As the formations crossed into the Reich, the Luftwaffe scrambled more than 200 fighters to intercept. They expected to find isolated bombers, tired and vulnerable. Instead, they found Mustangs, sleek, fast, and unrelenting. When the German pilots closed in, they were met not with scattered defensive fire but with coordinated counterattacks from American fighters above and behind the bomber stream. For the first time, the bombers were not alone. Blakesley's group swept ahead of the formation, diving through layers of cloud to meet the German interceptors. The combat that followed was savage and chaotic. The sky over Brandenburg filled with twisting contrails and burning aircraft. By the time the engagement ended, the Americans had claimed 15 victories, and the bombers had reached Berlin intact. Inside the Reich Chancellery, Hermann Göring refused to believe the reports. When shown gun camera footage of Mustangs over Berlin, he reportedly muttered, "When I saw American fighters over the capital, I knew the war was lost." The quote's authenticity remains debated, but the sentiment was real. In the weeks that followed, the transformation of the air war became undeniable. The Mustang was not just a fighter, it was a strategic weapon. Its extended range and lethal agility allowed the Allies to take the offensive everywhere. During Big Week, from February 20 to 25, 1944, the 8th Air Force launched thousands of sorties against German aircraft factories. The Mustangs swept the skies clean, tearing into interceptors before they could climb. In 6 days, the Luftwaffe lost more than 500 fighters and, more crucially, hundreds of irreplaceable veteran pilots. General Doolittle's gamble, to let his fighters hunt freely, had paid off. For the first time since 1939, the Luftwaffe was fighting a war it could not win. The mathematical advantage that had once belonged to Germany now belonged to the Allies. Every destroyed German plane meant not just one less aircraft, but the loss of a skilled pilot who could never be replaced. The Mustang had shattered Germany's air defense doctrine. Their bases, once considered safe, now lay within Allied reach. Luftwaffe commanders realized that no corner of their homeland was beyond danger. The next phase of the war would show how that realization broke the backbone of German resistance. In the spring of 1944, the skies over Europe told a different story. The hunter had become the hunted. What had once been an organized, confident Luftwaffe defense began unraveling into chaos. The Mustangs, operating from England and newly captured bases in France, dominated the air from dawn to dusk. Their range and speed allowed them to escort bombers to targets once thought unreachable: Munich, Prague, Vienna, and still loiter to hunt stragglers on the return. The Luftwaffe's problem was no longer equipment but exhaustion. German industry still produced hundreds of fighters each month, but they lacked the fuel and trained men to fly them. American bombing campaigns, now escorted all the way to their targets, struck at the synthetic oil plants that sustained the German war machine. Refineries at Leuna, Berlin, and Pölitz burned night after night. By July 1944, aviation fuel production had dropped from 175,000 tons to just 30,000. In September, it fell to 10,000. Without fuel, even the most advanced aircraft were grounded. Pilots waited on airfields beside silent machines, their flight suits smelling of gasoline they could no longer afford to burn. Major Johannes Steinhoff, one of Germany's most respected commanders, later admitted, "We had the world's best jets, but no fuel to fly them. I watched them sit on the runway, gleaming, useless, while Mustangs circled overhead." Meanwhile, American losses were decreasing even as their missions grew bolder. Bomber formations once shredded over Schweinfurt now returned in strength. For the crews who had endured the Black Thursdays of 1943, the change felt miraculous. They still faced flak, cold, and fear, but no longer the relentless slaughter of unescorted missions. The P-51 had restored the balance of survival. The psychological effect was just as profound. Luftwaffe pilots who had once flown with swagger now took off knowing they were outnumbered and outgunned. Each sortie became a test of endurance, each mission a gamble against impossible odds. Letters recovered from downed pilots tell of resignation rather than rage. One wrote to his wife in April 1944, "We take off knowing most of us will not return. The Americans are always above us, always waiting." What began as a technological breakthrough had become a strategic collapse. The Luftwaffe could no longer defend Germany's factories, its oil, or its cities. The consequences would soon be felt on the ground, where the Allied invasion of Europe was about to begin under skies completely owned by the Mustang. June 6, 1944, D-Day. The beaches of Normandy erupted under the largest invasion force in history. Above them, the sky belonged entirely to the Allies. Nearly 15,000 Allied sorties filled the air that day. The Luftwaffe managed only 319. Of those, barely 2 reached the beaches. One was flown by Joseph Pips Priller of JG-26, who made a lone strafing pass along Sword Beach with his wingman. He later described it as suicide disguised as duty. The reason for that imbalance was simple: the P-51 Mustang. Its long reach and relentless patrols had crippled the Luftwaffe's ability to even take off. Every attempt to mount an organized counterattack was met by squadrons of Mustangs waiting above the airfields. Young German pilots, many with less than 60 hours of total flight time, faced battle-hardened Americans who had flown hundreds. The result was catastrophic. Between January and May 1944, the Luftwaffe lost more than 10,000 pilots. Training schools shortened their programs from 250 hours to under 50. Replacements arrived at the front barely able to land safely, much less fight. For the veterans who survived, the experience was demoralizing. By 1944, recalled Ace Walter Schuck, "We were no longer knights of the air, we were prey." The Germans tried to adapt. They created Sturmgruppen, heavily armored assault wings flying F-190s packed with cannon and armor plates. These formations were designed to smash through escort screens and reach the bombers at close range. But the Mustangs met them head-on, using speed and altitude to pick them apart before they could even form up. Others pinned their hopes on technology: the Me-262 jet and the rocket-powered Me-163 Comet. On paper, these aircraft outclassed everything in the sky. In practice, they arrived too late, too few, and too thirsty for fuel. Adolf Galland, one of Germany's most experienced commanders, later summarized the reality. The Mustang was not just another fighter. It was the weapon that killed the Luftwaffe. By early 1945, Germany could still produce aircraft, but not pilots or gasoline. Mustang patrols reached into every corner of the Reich, strafing trains, convoys, and even airfields minutes before takeoff. American pilots circled over landing strips, waiting for German jets to appear, then diving to destroy them before their wheels left the ground. Lieutenant Urban Drew's downing of 2 Me-262s in a single pass in October 1944 became a symbol of that dominance. The Luftwaffe's collapse mirrored the crumbling Reich it had once defended. By April 1945, German air units could barely muster a few hundred fighters. In many cases, aircraft were destroyed on the ground by their own crews to prevent capture. Those who survived the final months spoke later of the unbearable silence that followed. Skies once filled with engines now empty, broken only by the sound of distant Allied bombers returning from yet another mission unchallenged. The war in the air was over. The Mustang had done what no bomber alone could achieve. It had destroyed the Luftwaffe from within. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the skies over Europe told the story of a revolution. In less than 18 months, the P-51 Mustang had transformed air warfare. What began as an improvised collaboration between American engineers and British designers became the weapon that gave the Allies total control of the air and the ability to strike wherever they wished. Its legacy went beyond victory. The Mustang proved that industrial ingenuity could achieve what courage alone could not. It symbolized a new kind of warfare, where range, logistics, and production mattered as much as bravery. The aircraft's sleek lines and unmatched reach were not just design triumphs. They were expressions of what a united alliance could accomplish when necessity demanded invention. For the Luftwaffe pilots who survived, the Mustang became both a nightmare and a teacher. Many would later admit that its arrival shattered every illusion they had about invincibility. "When we saw Mustangs over Berlin," one German veteran said, "we knew the war was lost. We had underestimated a nation that could turn factories into weapons faster than we could shoot them down. The P-51 did more than win air battles. It exposed the limits of ideology and the power of cooperation. It showed that freedom, organized, determined, and fueled by innovation, could outfly tyranny. And so, the laughter that once echoed over Schweinfurt was replaced by silence over Berlin. In that silence lay the end of the Luftwaffe, the fall of a regime, and the proof that in war supremacy is not inherited, it is earned, engineered, and flown.